Without further ado, Pierre Rochard.
Awesome. Thank you for the very glowing introduction. So I'm the Vice President of Research at Riot Platforms. We're a publicly traded Bitcoin mining company. This is a picture of our facility, the one you just saw in the video, out in Rockdale, which is about an hour away from Austin, northeast. Oh, yep. Let me make sure that our audience on the internet is also benefiting from these slides. So I'm going to share screen. And then Okay, very good. Excellent. Now I just need to find my mouse. Okay, there we go. Yeah, Riot started mining Bitcoin in 2017 in a tiny facility in Oklahoma. Since then, we've grown to become one of the largest industrial scale Bitcoin miners. And we are expanding in Rockdale, and we're also building a new facility in Corsicana, which is south of Dallas. So we only mine Bitcoin in Texas on the grid at large scale. Got 94,000 S19 type mining rigs, 10.5 exahash, 400 megawatts, and in April, I can't say last month anymore as of today. In April, we produced 639 BTC, and we've got 7,000 saved up on the balance sheet. So as for myself, I learned about Bitcoin in 2012 when I was going to UT Austin, getting my bachelor and master in accounting. So I'm not a real scientist, I'm an accountant. And started writing for the Nakamoto Institute, which is led by my good friend Michael Goldstein, aka Bitstein, who is also a resident of the great state of Texas here in Austin. Through my career, I worked at BitPay in Atlanta and Kraken, which is a large exchange. Joined Riot a year ago, and I've researched a number of different topics. Some of y'all may be familiar with, but they alone, each one would probably take up an hour to explain. But there was Ethereum supply gate, the chair inflationist situation, and the security budget fallacy. But today we're gonna, one more thing. Riot is hiring across a number of different roles. So please visit our LinkedIn and see maybe there's a fit here for a career change for you. Okay, so today we're gonna start off by talking about carbon emissions. And carbon emissions typically are, when people talk about inventorying carbon emissions, what they're talking about is this carbon accounting. And I put the accounting in air quotes because I'm a real accountant and this is not accounting. They've developed three categories. Interestingly, I kind of looked into the history of who decided to create these three categories. It was General Motors and British Petroleum, BP. So two massive carbon emitters decided that this is the framework to use, which is really, you might wonder about their motives. In any case, you've got Scope 1 emissions, which are actually measuring emissions of greenhouse gas molecules going into the atmosphere from assets that you actually own and control. Then there's Scope 2, quote-unquote, emissions that are a simulated estimate of third parties' Scope 1 emissions. In this case, whoever you're buying electricity from. So you're trying to guess what their carbon emissions are. And then Scope 3 is same concept, except for any purchase you make, right? So if you buy a microphone, you have to go figure out, okay, how much carbon emissions did the microphone manufacturing company emit, and then how much did their electricity company emit, and how much did their suppliers emit and how much did their employees emit. So it's very expansive. Interestingly, the GHG protocols framework does not include taxes. So if you pay taxes, they're not saying that you have to figure out how much is an M1 Abrams tank in Iraq emitting. That part they're not interested in learning about. So I thought that was interesting. This accounting is just riddled with holes and problems. But let me just cover a few ones. So the Scope 1 emissions are they're not bad, but they're not great either. So it's actually very expensive and complicated to scientifically measure your Scope 1 emissions. So what they do is they kind of apply rule of thumb estimates, right? And they extrapolate, okay, well, we know that typically this kind of car would emit this amount of CO2 and you drove this many miles. And so here's, what your greenhouse gas emissions were. The second big problem with Scope 1 emissions is there's an unknown quantity of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted, but not emitted by an asset that's owned by humans, right? So you might think of a volcano, for example, whose Scope 1 emissions are a volcanoes or a forest fires. Well, you could argue that maybe the landowner, well, what if it's a national park and et cetera. So lots of issues there that, there's lots of consultants that are happy to help out with. Then on the Scope 2 and 3 emissions, the number one problem is that they violate the most important accounting assumption, which is the entity assumption. So when you're doing the accounting for a business, you have to be really careful about not dragging in transactions from third parties. So for example, if you're doing the accounting for a corporation, you don't want to start including transactions that are related, or not that are related to, that are done by the suppliers of that corporation, right? Because ultimately you have to have some kind of boundary around, okay, this is the legal entity that we're doing the accounting for, and we're not going to start saying, okay, did your employee buy a Christmas tree? Let's include that as an expense for your corporation. No, the expense was the salary that was paid. So then we draw a line there. We don't start following where did the salary go afterwards, because that would just be completely unworkable. And also, it wouldn't be useful. It wouldn't be useful to anyone if you started to violate the entity assumption in accounting. However, when it comes to carbon accounting, they've decided to violate that entity assumption, which raises, it goes back to the question of, okay, why did General Motors and British Petroleum decide to add Scope 2 and Scope 3? Scope 1, we understand why they're adding it, because obviously if we lower greenhouse gas emissions, then we can stop climate change. Scope 2 and Scope 3 were really added in order to diffuse responsibility, so that GM and BP, they can be producing fossil fuels, be producing internal combustion engine cars, and then they can say, well, these are not our carbon emissions, they're your carbon emissions, right? So when Vistra operates a coal-fired power plant, they can say, yeah, sure, we have carbon emissions, but really they're our customers' carbon emissions. They're not our carbon emissions. And so that allows them to dilute responsibility and to, essentially be able to point the finger at others within the value chain. Now, the other problem with the Scope 2 and 3 emissions is that because they are simulated estimates, they're very easy to manipulate. So for example, you could lower your Scope 2 emissions by saying, okay, instead of buying my electricity from a natural gas power plant, I'm going to buy my electricity from a solar farm. Wow, that's great. You've really contributed to reducing carbon emissions. Well, hold on. What if those solar panels were manufactured in China using a coal-fired power plant? Well, now, if you include those emissions, maybe your move to solar wasn't actually as green as you're claiming it was. So there's lots of complexity there about how how is this useful for decision making, scope 2 and scope 3? The answer is it's not. It's not useful for decision making at all. What it's also useful for, though, is for control. So the government can say, hey, look, sure, it's your dishwasher is not directly emitting scope 1 emissions, but indirectly it is, right? Because it's taking power from the grid that was generated by coal or natural gas. And thus, we're going to regulate its energy efficiency, and we're going to make it so that this dishwasher uses less electricity, which is great, except now you have to run it twice. So you're potentially using more electricity than you would have beforehand. But in any case, it justified somebody's job in the Department of Energy. And the biggest problem with scope 2 and scope 3 emissions is that if you reduce them, you're not actually affecting climate change, because they're a fiction. They don't actually exist. So you can reduce them down to 0. And as long as there's still scope 1 emissions going on, you have not done anything about climate change. So this categorization has led to tremendous debate within the Bitcoin mining ecosystem, where on one hand, if you look at a Bitcoin mining rig, it's 0 emission, right, and comparable to an electric vehicle. And then on the other hand, there are Bitcoin miners who are saying, oh, we're going to get to net 0 emissions, and really what they're referring to is their scope 2 emissions, right, which is the scope 1 emissions of the power plants that they are leveraging. And further muddying the waters, some Bitcoin miners actually do own not only Bitcoin mining rigs, but they also might own power generating assets like a natural gas power plant. And so you'll read a news article that says, oh, Bitcoin mining is emitting CO2. And what they're referring to is the natural gas power plant that is also owned by the same legal entity, by the same Bitcoin miner that is adjacent to that mining facility. But they're conveniently conflating those two things. Now, earlier this year, I received an email saying that the New York Times is going to write about Riot and about our tremendous CO2 emissions. So that was the reason why we shot that video. And it was really cool to see that the video actually got more likes on Twitter than the New York Times article. So we were able to ratio them, as the kids say, which was really cool. And I'd like to thank everyone in this room who contributed to that historic ratio of the New York Times. And really, there were a number of really misleading parts about this article. We can start with the actual photograph that was kind of the main photograph that they used, and you can see it here, where in the background you have a coal power plant. This is the Sandow coal power plant that is owned by Luminant TXU. And in front of it, you have an aluminum plant that has been repurposed by BitDeer, a Bitcoin mining company, to mine Bitcoin. So this picture might lead you to think that this coal-fired power plant is providing electricity to these Bitcoin miners. The reality is that the coal-fired power plant has been decommissioned for 10 years and is actually being torn apart currently. So in no way is it operational, and in no way is it emitting any CO2 or any other pollutants for that matter. Now, the picture itself, there's some debate about whether it's hazy due to photoshopping or hazy due to the early morning dew when the picture was taken. But again, the haze is completely unrelated to any kind of air pollution that maybe the readers of the New York Times would kind of infer from the context here. There's, as I mentioned in the video, Rockdale has some of the freshest air I've ever breathed, and there's no reason to be implying otherwise. So the actual reporting inside of the article had all sorts of misleading claims, and it would be a stretch to call it journalism. It really should have been an opinion piece, maybe just a blog post on an obscure website, rather than kind of front page news. So the counter argument would be that, hey, Pierre, that's great. Okay, we understand that there's a separation between Bitcoin mining emitting CO2 and Bitcoin mining consuming so much electricity that it is incentivizing power plants, natural gas and coal power plants to emit CO2. And so, doesn't that causal relationship mean that Bitcoin mining has some kind of moral, obligation or ethical or legal obligation to kind of reduce its electricity consumption? And I would really push back on that for just one reason, which might seem obvious in hindsight, which is that coal and natural gas power plants are already regulated by the EPA. Their emissions are already regulated, and they've been regulated for most of 50 years now. And so the idea that the downstream consumers of a good or service should be responsible for the upstream activities of the producers, it's very far-fetched, and in practice it would be completely unworkable. Otherwise, the legal system would constantly be clogged with kind of situations of, hey, you turned on these Christmas lights and it emitted CO2. So the EPA has actually put out a proposed rule for carbon emissions and greenhouse gases in general from power plants. And that's really where the solution is, because that's where the problem is. The problem, is from the power plants. It's not from the consumers of electricity. And that if the EPA gets its way, what we'll see is that coal plants will, for the most part, be retired before the year 2035, and that natural gas plants will evolve towards either using hydrogen as input for their fuel, and I believe the pollution from that would be H2O, a deadly chemical that is being consumed in this room right now. And the other proposed solution that people suggest for natural gas power plants is carbon capture. So basically, you take these carbon emissions and you catch them, and you either store them underground or in some kind of container. I don't know. It doesn't sound particularly economical. I think it just would make more sense to build big, beautiful nuclear power plants. But in any case, the policy solution has nothing to do with Bitcoin mining. It has nothing to do with data centers, with consumers of electricity. It's purely about how are we going to regulate the production of electricity in a way that meets the needs of society, while avoiding negative externalities of air pollution or water pollution and noise pollution as well. Okay, so one last point here, which is really putting things into perspective. So one estimate I've seen for global Scope 1 emissions from human activity is 49,000 million tons of CO2 per year. There's a gas leak in Turkmenistan, which is emitting 366 million tons of CO2 per year. And Bitcoin mining Scope 2 emissions are estimated to be 71 million tons of CO2. So in terms of kind of solving problems, I think the New York Times should really have focused on Turkmenistan and going after the Scope 1 emissions over there. And it goes back to the problem of inventorying Scope 1 emissions. The only reason that this 366 million tons of CO2 was discovered was because of satellite imagery, which you see here below. It's not like the government of Turkmenistan, which, by the way, is responsible for this massive emissions leak because it is a state-owned energy company that is causing this leak problem. So they did not volunteer this information, right? They weren't like, hey, we're going to disclose our 366 millions of CO2 emissions. No, it had to be done surreptitiously by kind of from the sky through a satellite. So I think that's the other part of the solution, is that not only do we need to have zero emission electricity production, whether it's through nuclear, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, but we should also think about these problems from a big to small, right? Let's look at the really big sources of emissions that are easy to fix before we start trying to fiddle with dishwashers and reducing their carbon footprint. Okay. Yeah, plant a tree. Any questions before we go to the next topic or comments? No? All right. Let's talk about the electricity grid here in Texas. The electricity grid is a very complex system and with lots of interdependencies. So it's, when with Winter Storm Uri, I think that there was lots of finger pointing of, oh, this caused the power outages or this caused the power outages. The reality is that in a complex system like this, when you have a giant failure like Winter Storm Uri, there is not one single cause. It's a cascading set of causes of the perfect storm, really. And if we look at the story of what happened on that day and then on the subsequent days, it's interesting that ERCOT, the kind of the grid reliability entity that obviously we should blame, I actually think that they deserve credit for preventing a much worse outcome. The much worse outcome would have been that the entire grid goes down for months due to all the electrical equipment getting fried. And so they really, in real time, had to make some really tough decisions in order to minimize the amount of damage done to the grid by this crazy set of circumstances from a winter storm that, I've lived in Texas for many years now. That was pretty unprecedented in my experience. And it kind of just hung over Texas for many days. So it was a bad situation. And there's lots of, solutions that have come out of that for different parts of the stack of the grid. I think that the solution set that really makes the most sense and that has been most impactful is what's called weatherization. And so natural gas power plants had things freezing and causing the power plant to no longer be able to produce electricity. So weatherization should prevent that the next time there's a Winter Storm Uri. But nevertheless, it has scarred policymakers here in Texas and voters as well. Okay, so electricity markets on the grid have kind of three big parts. One is the spot market, which is kind of the real-time market of what's the price of electricity right now. The day-ahead market, which as its name implies, is kind of thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow. And I should include here that there's also long-term contracts, right? So you can buy electricity for 10 years out. And then the ancillary services markets we'll talk about in a minute. What I want to really highlight here is what's called the fuel mix, which is a little bit misleading because some of these don't have fuel. Or the fuel is not what we typically think of as fuel. So in orange at the top there, you have solar. And this is over just the course of one day, yesterday, actually. And so you see that solar increases during the day and decreases at night. And then below it in blue, you have wind. Wind is also fairly variable, just depending on how much wind there is out in West Texas, mostly. And below that, you have natural gas in purple. Natural gas is kind of the general purpose adjusting mechanism here for electricity production, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And then below that, you have coal. Coal is still about 15 to 20% of electricity production in Texas. But if you look at coal over the past couple of decades, it has been decreasing in its market share, in particular relative to natural gas, because natural gas has become a lot less expensive due to advances in fracking technology for extracting natural gas from the ground. And then at the bottom, you have nuclear. Good old reliable nuclear just doing its thing, and it's about 10% of the grid electricity production. So this chart illustrates what's called the duck curve, and you can kind of see the duck in yellow there. And this is actually, if you look at the consumption of electricity minus all the people who have solar panels on top of their houses, right, or at their business, and also just industrial scale solar farms, and they decrease, they offset, or they net out kind of consumption of electricity, but they only do it from, you can see here, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., right, and really, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. in particular. So you have lots of volatility just on a daily basis, and then if you look at it seasonally, there's also massive seasonal volatility. So we need a lot more electricity during the summer here in Texas in order to run air conditioning, and not a whole lot on the shoulders, right, of spring and fall. And then in the winter, you just get those cold snaps that do cause an increase in electricity consumption. All of that volatility means that we have to go through this stack of electricity production rather rapidly sometimes. So you've got nuclear and hydro. You don't really turn those on and off. You've got base load, coal or gas. In Texas, it's mostly gas. That you also don't really turn on and off. Importing power, we actually do have a tiny amount of import-export, but it's very little because ERCOT is kind of an island relative to the rest of the United States. And then we don't have any flexible hydro in Texas, but we do have lots of combined cycle gas and peaker plants for natural gas. So what's missing, though, from this is the renewables, or the unreliables, as they could also be called, of solar and wind. But basically, if there's no wind and the sun is setting, then you're going to have to speed run through this stack and start turning on a bunch of peaker plants. And turning on a peaker plant can take 30 minutes. And so during that time, you can see tremendous volatility in the price of electricity just on a day-to-day basis because of the combination of the duck curve and the dispatch curve. Okay, so let's bring it a little closer to Bitcoin. Bitcoin miners have a break-even price. So this chart here is from our friends Lancium, who are based out of Texas. And it's basically just showing, based on the network hash rate and the Bitcoin price, what is the revenue per megawatt hour, which is also kind of what's the most a Bitcoin miner would pay for electricity, because if they paid more than that for electricity, then they would be running at a loss on their marginal production, which would be irrational. They should turn off. So generally, the break-even price is between $100 and $200 per megawatt hour. This depends on lots of variables, but there's local variables like what's the efficiency of your miners, and then there's global variables like the price of electricity, network difficulty. Next year we've got the halving, so the break-even in theory doubles. And then you got transaction fees. So over the past 6 months, we've seen transaction fees go up and down quite a bit. So that can also affect the break-even of Bitcoin miners. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I mentioned, when we speed run through the dispatch curve due to the duck curve, the electricity price can spike. And we saw that happen over and over and over last summer. In July here. This is a chart. In red, you have the locational marginal price, LMP, which is the price of electricity in this particular part of Texas. And in blue, you have the power consumption of a Bitcoin miner. So you see that when the electricity price spikes up, the Bitcoin miner turns off their power consumption so that they're not paying those really high electricity prices, which means that essentially by reducing demand during those peak times of the duck curve, they are freeing up electricity for others on the grid, electricity that's coming from that base load. And also, by selling into the market at that point, or at least by not buying, they are effectively pushing down the price of electricity for everybody else on the grid. So this is what people are referring to when they talk about Bitcoin miners providing, economic curtailment and helping stabilize the grid. Now, there's kind of 3 layers to it. One, as I mentioned, avoiding that high electricity price. 2, a Bitcoin miner might have in place what's called a power purchase agreement, where they have prepaid for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of electricity. And so they bought all of this electricity, and when they turn off and when they don't consume that electricity, they can sell that electricity to others in the market. And that allows them to earn power credits so that then they can use those power credits to, for the rest of their electricity cost when they're not turning off, and essentially lower their electricity cost per megawatt hour. Third is ERCOT ancillary services. So I won't get into the nitty-gritty details here, but ancillary services are basically this, supply and demand on the grid has to always balance. But when we talk about always balance, we can talk about it in the abstract, oversimplified way and say, it nets out to zero. But when you really zoom in, you realize that it's never really perfectly balanced. It's always kind of bouncing around, and there's some room for some wiggle room. And so that said, you don't want to go outside of that wiggle room, because then you start having brownouts and blackouts, and that's not a good look. So ERCOT's role is to keep the grid supply and demand inside of that wiggle room. And they do that using ancillary services, where they buy the right, but not the obligation, to control power generation and load. And so this gives them the option to turn off load, turn on load, turn off power generation, turn on power generation, so that they can fine-tune the grid at various resolutions. So the kind of the smallest resolution is regulation service, reg up, reg down, which is very short time frames of needing to be able to balance the grid in very short amount of time. And then responsive reserve service, RRS, which is kind of zooming out a little bit to maybe save minutes. And then you've got non-spin, which is within 30 minutes. So that's maybe where a peaker plant or not even so much a peaker plant, but a natural gas power plant might run at 70%, and then when they sell 30% of that capacity to ancillary services, so that ERCOT can say, hey, you now need to go to 100% so that we can stabilize the grid. And the cool thing is that Bitcoin miners, if they jump through the hoops, can participate in ancillary services and bid into them so that they can also be helping stabilize the grid for this kind of use case and competing in this market with others. But it's still should be thought about somewhat separately from the other kind of more just purely economic curtailment, which is unrelated to ERCOT telling you to turn on or off. Okay. Next, I'm going to kind of give a brief update on the Texas legislature. Any questions, comments on the grid part with Bitcoin mining? Yeah. Yes. Yep.
Any other questions?
I'm curious to hear more about nuclear having perspective on how to move that ball forward.
Perspectives on nuclear, just for the people on the street.
Yeah. So the question is, do I have perspectives on how to move the ball forward on nuclear? No, I don't. I think that I've heard some activity around small modular reactors, which are like the one model that I saw recently was 300 megawatts, which to me is like, okay, well that's not really that small, and it would be cool to get 5 of those and plug in some Bitcoin miners. But I think that there's a lot of regulatory challenges around it. But there's also, I've heard differing opinions on the economics of nuclear. I've heard some people say it's exorbitantly expensive, and others say actually it's dirt cheap. It's too cheap. It's unfairly cheap. So I don't know. Open to learning more about nuclear.
So there's now, as of this year, a Texas nuclear caucus in the legislature advocating for improvements in the local policies. And of course, we're also waiting on some federal changes that have been in the works since 2017. I will plug the American Conservation Coalition, which I run the local chapter of, which advocates for nuclear, among other things.
That's great. Yep. That is good news. The more nuclear we get. Now, I know that there's the one nuclear plant we have in Texas is Comanche Peak, and they were going to expand it. They were going to double it using Mitsubishi as their contractor, and then Japan decided that they wanted to get back into nuclear after having gotten out of it with Fukushima, and so Mitsubishi pulled out of that, and so that's why we're not getting a doubling in nuclear power in Texas. Sad story. Anything else grid Bitcoin mining related? Yeah.
Has Riot looked into producing your own power with turbines or micro turbines?
So I'd say that, I mean, generally our strategy has been vertical integration. And so most recently we acquired ESS Metron, which is an electrical equipment manufacturer based out of Colorado. And when we think about vertical integration in Bitcoin mining, there's a lot of different verticals. Power generation is one of them, but we don't have anything concrete there. And I would generally say that there's in the policy space, people say you guys should produce your own electricity so that you're not taking electricity away from other people on the grid. But if you actually talk with people on the grid, they'll say, no, we want there to be very active market, wholesale market between supply and demand. And we don't want Bitcoin miners to try to declare independence from the rest of the grid and have autarky and, you know, be just mining behind a power plant and not participating in a two-sided market. So I don't think that there's like a slam dunk case for Bitcoin miners running power generating assets. And if you look at the economics of power generation, you know, you could point to the recent restructuring of Talon Energy. There's others. I mean, it's a tough market, right? I mean, Bitcoin mining is a tough market as well. And it also involves dramatically different skill set. So operating a power plant is different than operating a data center. And so or operating, you know, wind and solar is, you know, a beast of its own. So personally, I did install solar panels on top of my house, and it really, the economics of it did not work out for me. But that might be a personal problem, and that's unrelated to your question. Any other questions before we move on to some of the activity in the Texas legislature? All right. So the Texas legislature saw a few bills related to Bitcoin mining and the grid. The first one was SB 1751, which was actually pretty hostile towards Bitcoin mining in Texas. They wanted to limit Bitcoin miners in ERCOT ancillary services to a ceiling of 10%. And it's basically just saying, hey, you guys are too competitive. You're underbidding everyone else and you're gaining market share. And so we need to stop you from competing with others for ancillary services. The second part of the bill was essentially making it so that Bitcoin miners can't get tax breaks from counties. These temporary tax abatements that are designed to kind of attract economic development to rural counties. And the justification provided was that Bitcoin mining in Texas has grown so much. We're so far ahead of every other state and every other country that we need to remove any incentives that exist and kind of just avoid having this industry grow more. And my view is that Texas has an abundance of energy, and there's room for lots more Bitcoin mining in Texas, and it's creating lots of jobs and tax revenue for the government. And so there's really no reason to limit its growth or to target it for penalties. And so this bill passed the Texas Senate, but it did not get a hearing in the Texas House. So I think that going forward, it's unlikely that bills like this will make progress in the legislature, but it was kind of just surprising to see this kind of activity. But, you know, at the same time, not surprising given how quickly Bitcoin mining has grown in Texas ever since China tried to ban it. A bill that did get passed was SB 1929, which essentially makes it so that big Bitcoin miners over 75 megawatts register with ERCOT in a new category called large flexible loads. And so here the reasoning is that if all the Bitcoin miners in ERCOT have the same break-even point, let's say it's $100 per megawatt, and the price of electricity goes from $20 a megawatt to $1,000 a megawatt in the span of, you know, a half hour, that would mean that you'd have gigawatts and gigawatts of Bitcoin miner load turning off all at the same time, all at the same price. And if you turn off lots of load like that, you cause the you cause an imbalance in the supply and demand of electricity, and you cause the frequency of the system to get out of whack, and you can cause brownouts and blackouts. Just like if you turn off lots of power generation, like happened with Winter Storm Uri, you can cause problems for the grid. So turning off too much load is a problem, and it's a problem that's somewhat unique to Bitcoin mining because all the Bitcoin miners have kind of the same range of break even in terms of electricity price. So this by having Bitcoin miners be visible to ERCOT and participate in what's called SCED, which is kind of a dispatch schedule, they can say, okay, instead of having all the Bitcoin miners turn off, we'll have this Bitcoin miner turn off first, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. So we have some, scheduling, some ordering of who's shedding load so that we're not causing a massive imbalance on the grid from the electricity price going up. The second, which is totally, valid. The second was that you can have a feedback loop between the electricity price and the Bitcoin mining load. So in this scenario, you could have the electricity price is at $80, and then it goes to $120. All the Bitcoin miners turn off, and the electricity price goes back to $80 because there's lots less demand. And then all the Bitcoin miners say, hey, we're back below our break even. Let's all turn on at the same time again. And then the price goes back above $120. And then they all say, oh, we're back above our break even. So now let's all turn off again. And you get this endless feedback loop because there's no staggering of turning off and on and allowing the price to adjust kind of marginally rather than discontinuously with the break even. So the third is under voltage disconnections. So basically what will happen in some scenarios is that there's a little bit of slack in the grid, and so there's a period of under voltage that rolls through the transmission lines, and you could in scenarios like that, it might be good to have your electrical equipment trip and turn off, right? Because you don't want to damage your electrical equipment. But if you're having 1 gigawatt of load trip and turn off due to under voltage, you could actually cause the problem to get worse and cause the grid to destabilize and potentially melt down some equipment, cause a substation to light on fire or whatever it is. And so they want to know where the large flexible loads are so that they can make sure that those loads are set up to be able to ride through under voltage, so that if there is under voltage, it doesn't just trip off and remove a gigawatt of load. Instead, it just survives. Now, by what mechanism? I'll let the electrical engineers handle that. I'm just an accountant. But that is a very real risk that they wanted to address by having lots of visibility on these large loads on the grid. So that passed the House and the Senate, and now it's just waiting for the governor to sign it. Now, two grid bills that are not directly related to Bitcoin miners, but no, they should be Bitcoin miners should be aware of because it could affect the price of electricity that they're paying. One is SB 2627, which and also you should be aware of this as a taxpayer and as a voter here in Texas, is that the state is going to lend out money to reliable generation, whether it's natural gas or nuclear. It's probably going to be natural gas, but and it's subsidized. So you get this 3% interest rate. It was interesting. I was looking at the history of the bill, and at one point the interest rate was based on what the Fed funds rate is. So if the Fed funds rate goes up then the interest rate on these loans would go up. But somebody changed it to be a 3% fixed rate, which is way below what Fed funds rate currently is, and is quite nice, especially with the 20-year term. I mean, you even subsidized mortgage rates are way higher than that. But they only cover 60% of the cost. And you also get a big bonus if you complete this construction before 2029 in 6 years. The other grid-related bill is SB 7, which creates a new ancillary service. I mentioned the kind of the longest time frame one was 30 minutes. This one's going to be 2 hours. Reading the bill, it wasn't clear to me if it was for just power generators or if loads like Bitcoin miners could participate too. That is probably going to be decided on by ERCOT. So if you care about participating in ancillary services, you should get engaged with the rulemaking process at ERCOT to make sure that you get included in this new ancillary service. And then the second part to SB 7 was the performance credit mechanism. This one is hugely controversial because it essentially allows natural gas and nuclear and reliable power generation to charge more to retail, to people buying electricity, and it's essentially a tax on retail buyers of electricity, so that natural gas and coal and nuclear power plants earn extra income to reflect the fact that they are more reliable than solar or wind. Now, it was so controversial that I think that they got it to be where this will be the case in 2027, which gives them lots of time to not do it. But those are the two other ones. So huge shout out to Texas Blockchain Council, Lee Bratcher and Christine Cranley, and the rest of the team at Texas Blockchain Council did a fantastic job in the Texas legislature over the past 6 months, and even for years before, kind of laying the groundwork to be able to stop bills that are bad and help bills that are good get through. And also Satoshi Action Fund helped out, Digital Chamber of Commerce helped out, and at the federal level, Chamber of Digital Commerce and Bitcoin Policy Institute have been doing a great job in DC. They helped stop the digital asset mining excise tax. The Biden administration was trying to put a 30% tax on electricity that Bitcoin miners buy. And it was really an absurd tax. Excuse me. It was an absurd tax because, they're saying, well, we got to stop climate change, obviously, right? So we got to tax Bitcoin mining. But if you had your Bitcoin mining rigs connected to your solar panels and to your battery, and you were really, self-contained on your own land, like not touching the grid, nothing, the tax still applied. It didn't matter that you were not emitting any CO2 or that, you weren't like causing any strain on the grid or anything like that. No, they expect you to collect the tax from yourself and remit it to the federal government. So it was an absurd tax proposal, and it did not make it through the debt limit negotiations. And I think the BPI and Chamber of Digital Commerce have done a lot of work in terms of helping educate policymakers, both Democrats and Republicans, to kind of explain that Bitcoin mining is not the bogeyman that some of its critics portray it to be. So yeah, definitely support these organizations. They're doing great work, and happy to take any questions on policy side of things.
I'll kick us off on the questions side right here.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry.
So on SB 1751, so it passed in the Senate, but the House didn't even look at it. How does that? Is that what?
Yeah, that's right.
How does that? Forgive my ignorance here.
Yeah. So these legislators are prolific. They write lots of bills, Most of them die. They don't make it through. Either because, we have kind of, I think the Schoolhouse Rock version would be that, oh, everyone voted on it and the majority voted no, and so the bill doesn't pass. But the reality is that most bills don't pass because they don't even get to a vote. And they're just not. And the other thing too is the Texas legislature only meets for 6 months every 2 years. And so it's very much a race to try to get high priority bills through. And so if something's not high priority, then it won't get passed. Even though, if they had an infinite amount of time, maybe it would have passed.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to ask another one here. So the SB 1929. So is that actually good for Bitcoin miners in some way? So they're not all just like turning off and then realizing they have to turn back on?
Yeah, great question. So I think the libertarian view is, oh, this is terrible. This is the government telling Bitcoin miners to register, and we should be opposed to that. I think the more realistic view is that one, this does not apply to your home miner. This is 75 megawatts. This is industrial scale business. This is data center, right? And practically speaking, it's probably already the case that ERCOT is well aware of your presence on the grid. So it's not like, you were flying under the radar before this. The other piece of this too is that I would liken it to if you go to Disneyland and you look like me and you say, hey, I'm going to buy a kid's ticket, for under 10, they might say, do you have ID showing that you're under 10, right? And so it's if you're wanting to participate in this system and to be a guest on the ERCOT grid, it's reasonable that you buy the ticket that you're qualified for, or that falls into the right bucket, because at the end of the day, ERCOT they don't have anything against Bitcoin mining at all. They're not anti-Bitcoin in any way. They're just looking at it purely from an electrical engineering perspective of, okay, we're trying to maintain a reliable grid. What are the unique properties of Bitcoin mining at scale that would undermine our ability to maintain a reliable grid? They're not thinking about it from the perspective of Bitcoin is separating money from the state, and so we have to track them and shut them down. That's not at all what's going on there. Yeah.
I got one more. Hogging it over here. On 2627, any details on the big bonus? If they complete the project by 2029, like what is that?
It's hard coded in the law. I did not note it down though. But I hope you earn it.
Thanks for doing this, Pierre. I really appreciate it. Amazing information there. I'm curious, have you done any research on like data centers and how they kicked off the internet? Because I know over here by the airport, we have data centers. You can actually go there if you have a business to do backups there locally as like, So I'm curious, did those type of organizations fall into the same thing, or is that completely different in the like early 90s, late 80s? I'm just curious if you have information on that.
Yes. So, Bitcoin mining is a data center, although maybe we'd call it a compute center or a hashing center. But it's different than Amazon Web Services because, or Google Cloud or any kind of data center like that, because if you turn off an AWS data center, websites go down. If you turn off a Bitcoin mining facility, Bitcoin does not care. Bitcoin network does not care. Maybe blocks come in a little more slowly at worst, if you're talking about a lot of hash rate going offline. But it really is a testament to the fact that Bitcoin is decentralized. And so you can turn off all the Bitcoin miners in Texas for an hour, and for the most part, people don't really notice. Bitcoin users don't really notice that. And the other part of it too is that Bitcoin mining is, from a computer science perspective, kind of a stateless process. So it's not like if you interrupt the hashing that it's like, oh, we had all of this work and now we've got to start over. It's very much like the roulette wheel. It's interruptible. So the similarity, though, is it's computers, right? It's just computers, and you got to cool them, and you've got to provide electricity to them.
Just a comment. I read that the Swiss legislature meets at a similar schedule as the Texas legislature. They meet like 3 months every year, and Switzerland is one of the freest countries in the world. So restricting the time of deliberations for the legislature is liberty preserving.
It is. Unfortunately, in Texas, there's a loophole, which is that the governor can call for a special session. And he actually just did that because the legislature was not able to agree on what to do with our money because they have way too much tax revenue relative to their expenses. And so they were going to try to figure out a way to give it back to Texans through property tax, reducing property taxes, but they couldn't agree on how to do it. And then the clock ran out, and then the next day the governor is like, okay, it's special session and you guys have to figure this out. But kind of beyond the scope of Bitcoin mining. But yeah, I agree, it's a good thing.
And for SB 1929, how is it going to be determined who's going to be shedding the load? Like which miners are going to be disconnected, are going to decide to disconnect, and which ones are going to decide to go back online? How's it going to be determined?
Yeah, so ideally, in the same way that is determined for power generation. And so you would bid into the schedule, and it would be a competitive process.
10%, there's that 10% ceiling for the miners. Do you know what the actual number was?
I've only heard hand wavy estimates, and I heard 20% currently and growing rapidly, and causing consternation among the incumbents. They're like, "Hey, what's going on here?" Because it's driving down the price as well. So it's not just that it's crowding them out. It's also like reducing their revenue materially. Which is great for ratepayers, for everyone else on the grid, because now you pay a lower price of electricity because ancillary services are less expensive. Yeah.
Anyone else? About anything?
Who are the main industries that were fighting the ancillary services?
Great question. So it's kind of the smoke-filled back room, right? Who's in there? Who's in the room? I don't know. There's lots of names that have been floated. Logically, there could be a mix of batteries, people who are trying to create industrial scale battery setups, and their economics are really tough, especially compared to Bitcoin mining, because basically they live and die by ancillary services. Whereas Bitcoin miners, ancillary services is just cherry on the cake, right? The cake is the Bitcoin. So that could be one theory. Another theory could just be that it wasn't so much that the competitors were trying to push this bill through. It was that the legislator behind this was just trying to find different levers to pull for removing incentives for Bitcoin miners in Texas. And so property taxes and ancillary services, which are completely unrelated, but they were related in the sense that this legislator might have read a news article that says, oh, Bitcoin miners are taking advantage of, these tremendous benefits here in Texas.
Yeah, I heard something about peaker plants and some very big interests.
Yeah, so this is where we really put on our tinfoil hats firmly. There was a bill that was similar to 2627 about subsidized loans, except much worse. And basically, it was the Berkshire Hathaway bill that said, hey, let's give $10 billion. Oh, wait, correction, $18 billion to Berkshire Hathaway so that they can build 10 gigawatts of power plants that we won't use unless there's another Winter Storm Uri. And my perspective on that bill was that, yeah, let's do that. And then when you guys are done building those power plants, we'll just kind of flip a switch and turn them on and mine 10 gigawatts of Bitcoin mining, and keep these power plants running. But that bill got killed in the House. And so 2627 was kind of a scaled down version of that bill that was able to scrape by. But yeah, there was a theory, the suggestion that maybe, if Bitcoin miners are stabilizing the grid, then you don't really need as much of natural gas peaker plants. And so this Berkshire Hathaway very expensive proposal is a waste of taxpayer money.
Anyone else?
So you see the ESG narrative attacking, miners so much all the time, right? Are there any other attack vectors that you see in the industry that could possibly target mining rather than ESG? Because you're already proving that it's misinformation with facts. So like, what are some potential attack vectors, I guess?
Yeah, so we saw one which was in the New York Times article of Bitcoin miners driving up electricity prices, which is really about like trying to create popular resentment towards Bitcoin miners by saying, hey, look, your electricity bill's going up because these people are consuming lots of electricity. And I think that narrative worked pretty well last year not because Bitcoin mining was growing and having any causal effect on electricity prices, but rather because the price of natural gas was skyrocketing last year because of nuclear plants shutting down, as well as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So those kinds of factors that can drive the price of natural gas. The idea that there was so much Bitcoin mining happening that the price of natural gas went up is absurd. But nevertheless, that was kind of a narrative put forth by the New York Times. And it was interesting because in the New York Times, they said a proprietary black box simulation said that Bitcoin miners drove up electricity prices by 5%. And it was weird because electricity prices actually went up way more than 5%. So it's like, okay, I'm trying to do the mental math here of like what the argument is. But I asked the person who ran the simulation, hey, can we take a look at some of the assumptions that you have going into this simulation? Because the simulation, you can push the results up or down, 50%, just based on using what assumptions you use. No, sadly, the proprietary data feeding into the model is not available to the public. So no peer review on that quote unquote science.
Isn't 5% less than the inflation rate?
Yes. So it's really bizarre that they ran with that. I think they would have done a better job of just saying electricity prices went up 20% and just kind of juxtaposing it with Bitcoin mining going up, not trying to establish a causal relationship, but just trying to imply one. I think that would have landed better than we hired some doofus to run a simulation and it said the price went up 5%, which is less than what it went up. So yeah, it's bizarre.
Anyone else?
Thanks, Pierre. This has been awesome. So if Texas is one of the best state to be mining Bitcoin, are there certain states that Riot ever looks at that also could be good to mine, or some on the fully other end of the spectrum so horrible that miners don't even want to look at, like where you don't even have these sort of dynamics between the grid because it's not as localized as ERCOT and you have just west and east? Are there just such different dynamics in these other states, or how do you look at that?
So I think that there's really two factors, which has to do with Riot's strategy, which is to do industrial scale mining. Because you can have a strategy of saying, hey, I'm going to have like small scale, but it's just, it can be a great business strategy to do small scale and to say, hey, I'm going to find stranded energy, or small pockets of cheaper power. But if you're trying to do like 500 megawatts or a gigawatt, you need to have two things. One, a geography where you have an existing thriving market of buyers and sellers of electricity. Because you can find a state that has low electricity price, but there's no liquidity, right? So if you start buying electricity there, you're just going to drive up the price of electricity very quickly. And then you can also find a state that has lots of supply and demand of electricity, but due to its location or its politics, its regulatory environment, maybe the price of electricity is too high there. And it's also about kind of the regulations of the electricity market. In Texas, people say ERCOT is a deregulated market, which I think is a misleading word used by critics of this market design, because it's, there's still regulation, as I've been discussing for the past hour, that there's ERCOT related, regulations. But what's not regulated, it's not centrally planned, like where they say, oh, the legislature is going to build a power plant and a company is going to have a guaranteed rate of return on it. And that's really what people are talking about when they talk about a regulated market, which often means that electricity prices are higher in those markets because it's not competitive on the power generation side. And that was, I think, a concern with the Berkshire Hathaway bill and this 2627 bill is it's the first time in a long time that Texas is moving away from this market-driven approach to electricity production and is kind of having some government intervention. The counter argument to that is that renewables like solar and wind are being so heavily subsidized that you can't call it a free market if the federal government is pouring billions of dollars into building wind and solar, and causing power generation to kind of be very lopsided in one direction. And so this really speaks to the fact that government intervention begets government intervention, right? They're always trying to fix some other problem that they created 5 years ago, and it's just an endless cycle.
Pierre, you have a way of kind of exposing things that are right there in front of everyone that they don't see. Like, so the run the numbers thing, it's like, hey, great, Ethereum, awesome. Well, like, can you audit the chain? Isn't this the whole point of this? And like, no. Okay, like, and people lost their minds. Then you came up with this New York Times article and your rebuttal to it, like, hey, guess what? Like, Bitcoin doesn't actually emit any CO2. And people were like, you can't say that, but in their arguments, they exposed kind of the double standard for it. What's next, Pierre? What's the next one that you're gonna do? Because it's fun to watch.
That is not up to me. That is up to our detractors, the Bitcoin skeptics. So, whatever they come up with next to attack us, then I'll try to think of a good rebuttal. I can't promise, that they'll be as good as past rebuttals, but, this one was really fascinating to see how upset people were about this video, because they've really built up a whole, you could call it an ideology, but I really think it's a religion around carbon emissions where, they talk about your carbon footprint, and they talk about like, the carbon footprint of buying a watermelon. And it's like, well, what are you talking? Like, there's no carbon footprint involved. There's a carbon footprint of an internal combustion engine. That part makes sense, So, but the reason that there's been such an expansion of this terminology of carbon footprint was really about trying to control people's behavior and trying to centrally plan the economy. And the other part of it too is that it's really hard to address the root cause. To say, okay, all right, how do we get rid of natural gas power plants? Well, you get rid of them by building nuclear plants, but a lot of the quote unquote environmentalists are anti-nuclear because, let's see, why? Because the Soviet Union built a bad nuclear power plant, in Chernobyl, and a handful of people died from that. And that's why we can't have nuclear power. And so this ideology has kind of spawned what's called degrowth, where they say, okay, we're not going to be able to invent our way out of carbon emissions. We're not going to be able to innovate our way out. What we have to do is restrict economic growth, and eventually, like, we need to have a negative GDP, right? We need to like reduce the size of the economy so that we reduce our impact on the environment. And so to kind of push back against that is really upsetting to these folks. The other thing too is that I mentioned the EPA is putting out rules to address Scope 1 emissions. And the popularity of Scope 2 and Scope 3 have been driven by the inaction or kind of the political difficulty of addressing Scope 1 emissions, meaning that the lobby for natural gas and oil and gas in general is so powerful here in Texas and in the United States that they've been able to block any kind of legislative attempt at reducing carbon emissions, direct carbon emissions. And so doing it through EPA rulemaking is kind of this fingers crossed approach that the Supreme Court will not intervene and or uphold the rule of law, depending on your perspective, and strike down this rulemaking. Because it's, I'm very skeptical that they'd be able to pass a law, a federal law that puts because here's what they should do, that puts an excise tax on carbon emissions, on direct emissions, and saying, hey, you have to pay this many dollars per million tons of carbon emissions, of direct emissions. If they did that, it would cause the price of electricity to, and I looked at what's going on in Germany, to be multiplied by 5, right? And ultimately, these politicians are elected by voters, and they realize that if they multiplied your electricity bill by 5, that perhaps they would not get reelected, and perhaps somebody who would repeal that law would get elected. And so because it's really hard to get anything done about direct emissions, they've built this whole cottage industry around indirect emissions. And, there's lots of carbon startups that are decarbonizing XYZ. They don't like it when people push back on it.
Anyone else?
As a nuclear advocate, have you seen the Oliver Stone film that's about ready to be released, Nuclear Now?
No, I haven't.
So I just saw on Rogan, he was on Rogan, and I saw the clip of it. He's talking about basically he is still a climate change believer, we'll say, because it's a religion. But he's also a advocate for nuclear, and he's actually coming out and destroying all of the misinformation around the Fukushima, around Chernobyl, around 3 Mile Island. And so he's coming out to advocate for nuclear. So I think it comes out in like a week or two. I just exposed to it today, so timely.
Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of a video I saw that was very similar to my video, except it was a person with a Geiger counter that measures radioactivity visiting a nuclear waste facility and not finding any radioactivity because of technology that allows us to stop the radioactivity from being emitted by the waste, which, you know, is another one of those things that the activists don't necessarily want publicized.
I had a question about just your personal experience. I assume a lot of us can relate to you as a Bitcoiner and as a business person, and we'll never be in the situation to see how the Texas legislation process unfolds and what the sentiments are. And I'm just wondering what it was like to go through that versus what your expectations were.
Yeah, I think I had some expectations that were kind of just like textbook civics class expectations, and the reality is a lot messier. And so, you know, you might have, for example, the bad bill, the 1751 that passed the Senate. You know, you'd go to the staff of these senators and you're like, hey, this is a bad bill. Here's why the senator should vote against it. And they're like, yeah, we kind of agree with you. It is a bad bill, but it's probably not going to pass the House. And we want to be friendly with the bill's author. And so we're going to vote yes on it. And it's like, all right, cool. Thanks. Thanks for doing your job. I guess. You know, probably a little more fluff around it. But, you know, and usually it's kind of done in the abstract of, hey, you know, we don't always get to vote on bills based on the merits of the bill. Yeah.
So I just wanted to, since Nuclear Now was brought up, that's our next planned event. We're planning a screening of Nuclear Now in the next, in June or July. And we don't have a date or a venue yet for it, but we'll announce that soon. Yeah.
Lots of indirect carbon emissions from movie screening. Yep.
Thank goodness.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. Pierre, thank you so much.
Thank you.